Despite the internet being cut off across most of the country, Iraqi protesters have found a way to upload videos onto social media sites that appear to show live fire and tear gas clouds. These are pictures Iraq's government doesn't want you to see. They paint a picture of what's happening on the ground and help explain why there have been many deaths and injuries over the past few days.
The protesters are not holding anything in their hands except for Iraqi flags. They're calling for the most basic of rights, employment and services. We need safety and an amnesty law that takes people out of the secret and public prisons. Iraq has become full of secret prisons. The authorities are building prisons only. They're not building hospitals or schools.
It's relatively better now the curfew has been removed. I hope that decisions made by the head of parliament and the prime minister are applied on the ground, because the Iraqi people have become bored of all the promises. We hope that these decisions are applied.
The protesters are angry over what they say is government corruption and lack of access to basic needs. A curfew that's been in place in Baghdad has now ended, but the situation is still tense. Despite the lifting of the ban here in Baghdad, Tahrir Square, the focal point for the protesters, is nowhere near as busy as it should be. As you can see, there's a big, heavy security presence. Now, what the protesters are doing is they're gathering in streets around Tahrir Square, which is what they've done in the last few days. What they're trying to do is get a critical mass together and come into the square. The protests are not just in the capital, but across the south and central part of Iraq. And now there's also a political crisis brewing. On Saturday, Parliament was to convene for an emergency session to discuss the protests. It never met. Three major political blocs refused to let their members of Parliament sit. Iraqi law requires a minimum number of MPs to be present before a session can begin. Instead, the Speaker of the Parliament, Mohammed al-Habousi, held a meeting with people who claimed to represent the protesters. Late on Saturday, he held a news conference surrounded by his party loyalists. It looked more like a campaign rally than a press conference, and with calls for an election from protesters and other parties, al-Habousi set out a range of economic reforms and social reforms he says his party will introduce.
Loans will be given in the form of credit. Bank credits be initiated for the purposes of establishing factories and providing equipment. This will enable us to steer away from any corruption. So facilities will not be given in cash loans, yet will be credit for the establishment of factories.
The Speaker's not alone in trying to appeal to the protesters. Iraqi politicians of all stripes and religious leaders appear to be throwing their support behind the protest movement. But it's not clear if the protesters will accept them, given the fact that they blame the same politicians for the dire economic situation that sparked their protests in the first place, and the government for violent scenes like these.
Well, Imran joins us live now from Baghdad. So, Imran, what's the mood there on the streets right now?
Well, we've seen protests take place here in Baghdad in the early hours of the morning. Once again, shots have been ringing out. Live fire has been used. We've also heard about protests in the rest of the south of the country. In fact, in Nasiriyah, and this is very interesting, what the protesters did was not just attack government buildings, but they attacked political party headquarters, which they burnt. And now in Nasiriyah, they're chanting, Nasiriyah is free of political parties. And that's crucial because there is a political crisis brewing here as well. A lot of the opposition politicians, a lot of the religious parties are taking a look at this protest movement, and they're thinking to themselves, it's not going away. If anything, it's getting bigger and more popular, and they're trying to appeal to the protesters. In my report there, you heard Mohammed al-Habousi, the Speaker of the Parliament. He's been even more explicit in the last few hours, saying that he wants to join the protest movement. Now, whether the protest movement actually take him to heart, considering they actually blame politicians of all hues for the problems, remains to be seen. But what we're seeing now is the biggest challenge to Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi's year-old government. He's appealed for calm. He wants the protesters to give him a chance to put in place reforms that he says will change things. That's not good enough for the protesters. So what it feels like is that we are seeing Iraq's politicians, Iraq's religious parties, see a sense a change in Iraq, and they're looking to see what they should do next. And it seems to me, and it seems to a lot of Iraqis, that they're actually going to try and support the protest movement.
All right, Imran Khan live for us there in Baghdad. Thanks, Imran.